Welcome back. Huge infrastructure projects like metro railways, toll roads and bridges use vast amounts of steel and concrete, building materials which contain a lot of carbon. And then there's the actual construction process itself, often using heavy earth-moving machinery that's powered by huge diesel engines. Think tank Infrastructure Partnerships Australia wants to introduce a carbon base case for major projects which would cut emissions. I spoke to its chief executive, Adrian Dwyer, a little earlier and asked him how this carbon base case would actually work.
We did a big piece of research 6 months ago into decarbonising the whole infrastructure sector, and what it found was you've really got three problems. You've got the energy sector, you've got transport, and then you've got the carbon that's embedded in the things that we build. Now, the energy sector decarbonises because the economics mean it will. The transport sector will decarbonise because it will electrify. But actually there's this prickly problem. In every kilogram of concrete we pour in the ground and every kilo of steel we hoist into the sky, there's huge amounts of embedded carbon. So that means carbon that's released in making those materials, which means the big infrastructure projects we're building have many millions of tonnes of infrastructure embedded within them. So the idea we've put forward would help address that problem by having knowledge at the front end and actually knowing how much carbon is in the things we build before we make the decisions to build them.
Yes, so concrete, steel, still steel. How do you actually reduce that carbon footprint for those sorts of building materials?
Well, there are things that you can do with the materials. You can move to lower carbon alternatives, lower carbon concrete, greener steel, but those technologies are a bit of a way off in terms of being scalable for the kind of investment task that we have ahead of us in infrastructure. But if you get early enough in the process, right at the business case, before cabinets make decisions on which investments to make, you can make some really big inroads into the amount of those products you use. You can make decisions to use less concrete. You can make decisions to use less steel. You can use alternative materials like laminated wood when you're constructing a train station. For instance, if you use less of them, you can have the dual impact of releasing less carbon in making those materials, but also potentially lowering the price of the infrastructure you build. So it can be a win-win if it's done right.
Your proposals for projects worth over $100 million. What sort of support from the construction sector have you received for this idea?
Well, in fact, we came up with this idea because after releasing extensive piece of work on decarbonising the infrastructure sector and focusing on this as an issue, we went and spoke to the big contractors, many of whom are our members at Infrastructure Partnerships Australia. And we said to them, how would you solve this problem? And the overwhelming message was, by the time these things get to us, the big decisions have already been taken and we're just trying to make margin in a really tight game. But actually, if you get early enough in the process and you design these projects properly, you can use lower carbon alternatives. You can use less of the material and it doesn't have to cost more in the process. So they're all on board with this idea, and actually it's just a process of getting it from the first thought. Right now we concentrate on time, quality and cost. We need to make it time, quality, cost plus carbon.
Are there any countries around the world that are doing this decarbonised infrastructure development already at a pretty high level?
Look, surprisingly, when we looked around the world, there aren't many. There's a few that do it for the occasional project. The only place we found that does this extensively is Sweden. So all transport projects in Sweden are required to produce a carbon base case when they put together a business case, and then that's competed through the process. So they require a lower carbon outcome through the bids that they receive for projects. But I was actually pretty stunned when we looked at that and found this isn't something that's just done as standard. We're literally flying blind on carbon when we make these decisions. So this seems like a really simple, relatively easy thing to implement that governments could pin their tail to and then be able to demonstrate how we're reducing carbon in the stuff that we build over the whole life cycle of the project.
What are some of the problems with getting this proposal over the line? Is it going to push up the cost of infrastructure developments? And we know costs are rising a lot right now with inflation.
Yeah, we don't think it has to push up the cost because one of the greatest benefits is in actually using less of the materials in the first place. So one of the challenges we have in infrastructure construction is the layering on of decisions that are increasingly risk averse through the process, and then you end up with an over-engineered solution to the problem. And that over-engineering in the past has just led to higher costs, but now also we know leads to higher carbon. So there's a really good environmental reason to do less of that over-engineering, and also has the added benefit of potentially reducing the costs. That gives us time to come up with the lower carbon concrete and the lower carbon steel that will deliver zero carbon infrastructure. That's a bit of a way off, but there's big steps we can make in the short term to just use less of the high emitting materials.
Job summits in Canberra this week. Obviously, construction industry is highly unionised. Is there any sort of workplace employment reform you'd like to see come out of this job summit?
Well, I'll be heading to the Job Summit on Thursday and Friday this week, really to argue for a few things around things like skilled migration, pathways to permanency in skilled migration, making sure we've got visas that match the length of project rather than being limited to a 2-year runway. And we'll also be talking about the in-demand skills that exist within the infrastructure sector. And the final thing a lot of my members are telling me is actually childcare is a huge impediment to participation in the workplace, so we'll need to be targeting that as well.
Well, Adrian Dwyer, Chief Executive at Infrastructure Partnerships Australia, thanks for coming on the program today.
Thanks, Ed. Good to be with you.